Hey, this is Alfred Edmond Jr., Senior VP and Executive Editor of Larger Black Enterprise. Welcome to another edition of Beyond the Hype. Today, we're going to get beyond the hype of criminal justice reform. And we're going to look at it really with a very, very different, now hopefully a broader angle than I think we've been accustomed to looking at it in terms of the surface conversation around criminal justice reform. And I got a great guest for this conversation, Malcom Glenn. He's the Public Affairs Director at Better.com. He's also a member of the Council on Criminal Justice. And we've had a couple of pre-conversations that really looks at this on a much broader scale. So just to kick things off, because I'm a big law and order junkie, let's think of this in terms of law and order. Because of the murder of George Floyd, because of everything that's sprung from that in terms of protests across the nation and around the world, we're very focused on the law part of reform. We're talking about policing reform, defunding the police, however you want to look at it, we're focused on the law part. Criminal justice reform, which has been building momentum over the last decade, really, focuses on the court, the order part. But this conversation, we're going to talk about what happens beyond the order part, which is we think about how much access to employment, re-enfranchisement in terms of being able to vote once you're released from prison, both important points, but don't necessarily get to the broader issues around what it really takes to have criminal justice reform in our communities. So Malcom, welcome to the show, first of all.
Well, thank you, Alfred. I am a big fan of the podcast, and so it's an honor to be a part of the conversation. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. So listen, before we do a deeper dive into criminal justice reform and beyond, talk to me about how you came to even be involved in this conversation, why this is important to you. You were formerly of Uber, you're formerly of Google, you're a tech guy, and there's certain stereotypical assumptions around tech people that might say that they wouldn't even care about something like this. But talk about your unique path to who you are and why this matters to you and why you're even on the board of the Council on Criminal Justice, so why you're a member.
Yeah, well, thank you for that question. I think it's a really important one because I think how people come to this space, how people come to recognizing the importance of this issue really informs how they go about trying to make the outcomes for the people impacted by this space better than they otherwise would be. As you mentioned, my background is in tech, and I spent a number of years at Google and spent a number of years at Uber, and I'm now at Better.com. I'm fortunate enough to have worked at a number of organizations that, for various reasons, have really taken to heart the importance of this issue. I worked at Google, and that was a company that spent a lot of time, energy, and resources on figuring out how they can be a part of reimagining the criminal justice system. And part of the reason why I think is it is a company that is really always super focused on questions of innovation and finding systems that are broken and making them better. Usually that looks more at digital systems, but there were enough people at the company who were thoughtful about what real life in the world physical systems look like, particularly ones that are impacting underserved communities, and how we can make them better. When I moved over to Uber, it was really sort of a light bulb moment, because Uber is this really interesting company that is at the intersection of both the digital and the physical worlds. You're literally using an app to either get people to bring something to you or to have a person come and take you from point A to point B. And the ecosystem that makes that process work involves a lot of people, and particularly a company like Uber that is doing this work at such a broad scale, it gives them an opportunity to really think about how they can give back to communities. And so the very long and short of it is, I started when I got to Uber, really having conversations with organizations in the community about how we could be better stewards in our community. At that time, we had really grown to a point where we were having a pretty monumental impact all around the world. And instead of just thinking about, are we growing business? Are we growing revenue? I wanted to ask questions about whether we were growing our footprint in a positive way. So I started to have conversations with NGOs and advocacy organizations and nonprofits in a bunch of communities. And they came back to me and said, you're doing a lot of really good work, but there's a lot of areas where you can improve, particularly around your driver screening process. You're disqualifying a number of drivers from driving with Uber who probably shouldn't be disqualified, who are may served their time, but shouldn't have the fact that they had to serve their time held against them. So we were invited to align our driver screening process at Uber around a ballot measure in California called Proposition 47, which effectively called for the reclassification of a number of low-level nonviolent felonies as misdemeanors. We did that work. As a result, we were invited to join the Obama White House Fair Chance Business Pledge. And we were one of the inaugural signers of that pledge, which was effectively our commitment to go beyond simply being the as a company, to really proactively work to create opportunities for people who are looking for work, who have served their time. Through that work, we started to have conversations with other businesses. Other businesses made clear to us that, hey, there's lots of sort of rhetorical commitment to this work in companies, but it's hard to make the pitch to the executives and the powers that be that this is worth investing real time and resources in. And we saw that as an opportunity. We are a company where every driver after, this is when I was at Uber, every driver after every ride gets a rating. And what we decided to do was we looked at those ratings for the folks under the old criteria versus the folks under the new criteria that was aligned around Proposition 47 in California. And what we saw is the drivers under the new criteria were just as safe, were doing just as good a job, and actually had marginally lower rates of incidents on the platform than the folks under the old criteria. So this was an indication to us that this was not just the right thing to do from a PR perspective or a branding perspective, but this was actually going to be good for your business if you proactively went out and thoughtfully figured out ways to recruit people to your platform, even if they had criminal records. And that was a light bulb moment for me, as I mentioned. My work in this space has really just sort of gone from there, and I'm happy to have continued to engage in a number of different ways.
You know, you made me think of something I wasn't even thinking about in terms of this conversation. When you think about the people in the front lines during the pandemic, Uber drivers and other transportation workers are on those front lines as essential workers, and a disproportionate number of those people are Black and brown people from disadvantaged communities. So when you see that interlap between, you know, with the impact of the pandemic and the work that you did with Uber, it really is kind of a light bulb moment. But the other thing that makes me excited about that story, which is why I think, while most people wouldn't assume that it's a tech conversation, to me, it's all a tech conversation to the degree that it's about analytics. And in business, what gets measured is what actually gets done. And if you don't have some type of analysis.
Alfred, can you hear me? I think we're having some issues. My apologies. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah, go ahead. I might just move spots, but continue talking.
Okay. Yeah, so my passion around this idea that technology has to be part of the equation of every initiative is because we know in business what gets measured is actually what gets done. And so analysis and data, as to your point, it's one thing to do it because it's quote unquote the right thing to do, or it's great media and you know, branding and public relations, but that doesn't stick. What sticks is, and look at the numbers about how this is affecting our business. This is no longer a gift or a charitable effort or a philanthropic effort. It's actually an opportunity that we can measure. And what gets measured and shows success gets repeated and expanded and duplicated. And that's why I happen to think why I wanted to have you on this conversation is because I think you're bringing a way to rethink the whole idea of reform, whether it's police reform, criminal justice reform, rehabilitation of disadvantaged communities, on a different level than I think most people and most corporations tend to look at it. And that bodes well for beyond the quote unquote crisis. I mean, obviously every corporation is focused on what can I do, what can I do, what can I do? But until there's kind of data and analysis that says what's effective, I don't know if the momentum will be maintained once this time passes. So tell me about, first of all, I'd like to know a little bit more about what you do specifically for better.org, better.com. And then I want you to go broadly into your passions around work in disadvantaged communities as it relates to criminal justice and beyond.
So I've been at better.com for just about a month and a half now. I lead public affairs for the organization, and effectively better.com is one of the fastest growing home ownership companies in the country. And It started out as a mortgage company, a way to more effectively and more easily give people access to getting a mortgage to help them buy a home. And it's expanded from there. So now Better is a mortgage company. It is a means of finding real estate agents to buy that home, but it is also a company for settlement services, for home ownership services. The notion being that if you're looking for an easily accessible way to go through the entire home buying journey, which is an arduous, oftentimes overly complicated and challenging journey, Better.com can be your solution for that. And my attraction to Better, I think, ties into a broader attraction I have to this notion of building healthy and wealthy communities. So in addition to my work at Better, I serve as a fellow for New America, which is a think tank based in Washington, D.C. I particularly am a fellow for the Future of Property Rights, where I look at questions of housing instability for people from underserved communities, and in particular, what the COVID crisis is going to mean in terms of exacerbating housing instability all across the United States. And I think folks have probably seen some of the headlines about the oncoming eviction crisis that's going to happen in the housing space, if it's not already underway. In addition to that, I serve as a senior fellow for an organization called the Center for Workforce Inclusion. And there we look at questions of how we can make the future of work and questions of workforce evolution better for people from underserved communities, with a particular focus on people who are 50 and older. This is oftentimes a category of workers that is not considered in questions of what the future of work is going to look like. But as younger generations continue to age and live longer, questions of what the future of work is going to look like for those communities is going to be more and more important. And I think all those things really tie together because they speak to what we do as institutions to make communities work better for people who are on the margins. So if you have a harder time getting access to work, if you have a harder time getting access to housing, whether that's from a purchasing standpoint, from a renting standpoint, there should be apparatuses in place to make that process easier. And if you add on to that a person who has a criminal record, it just exacerbates all of these issues. So when people usually emerge from the criminal justice system after having served time, the two biggest things that they're thinking about and the things that are most intimately tied to their rate of recidivism is whether they can find a place to live and whether they can find a place to work. And one of the things that was so interesting about Uber was one of the barriers when people did find that place to work was oftentimes transportation. So in terms of, as I mentioned earlier, the work that Uber did to bring more drivers onto the platform from a criminal justice standpoint, there was also a huge linkage between finding that job and then actually being able to maintain and sustain access to that job. So all of these elements are tied together because if we focus on ensuring that housing is more accessible and affordable, if we focus on making sure that we have quality jobs that give people the flexibility to get back on their feet, also while paying them enough to make sure that they can maintain their re-entry into society, we will create better, healthier, and more sustainable societies. And so when I had the opportunity to join the Council on Criminal Justice, it was a really, I think, perfect encapsulation of so many of the things that I've been working on, because criminal justice is in the title, but ultimately I think what the council is really focused on is that real sort of foundational question. How do we create and sustain communities that are going to do well on behalf of the people who need that help most? It's better for everyone. A small bit of investment in criminal justice reform, in housing policy, in workforce development means safer and wealthier communities. It means fewer people who are unemployed. It means a more sustainable way through crises like the ones we're experiencing now. So I think it's really important the way you sort of framed this conversation at the beginning. It's not just about one of these issues in a silo, but it's really about the totality of all of these issues and how they are impacted by the way that local community leaders go about creating policies that give people from underserved communities the best options to succeed.
You know, we have an annual event. Hopefully you'll participate this year because we're doing it virtually this year for obvious reasons. Well, called Black Men Excel. It's our annual celebration of excellence and leadership of Black men. It's a very unique event. And in the second year, I believe, of the event, we had a panel focused on criminal justice reform that included several formerly incarcerated people, including one who was had to be like in his late 50s. When you said that the whole point of employment and what the future work looks like for people 50 and over, I thought of him immediately. And he talked about the implications of being released from prison. I mean, whether you're 25 or 35 or 50, and going back into communities that will not sustain your ability because it's unhealthy in a variety of ways, whether it's the crime rate, whether it's access to jobs, whether it's access to transportation. It's like you're literally coming back to maybe you got better, maybe when you were in prison, but if that was the point, and then you come back to a sick community, the likelihood is you're going to end up back in quote unquote the hospital. You're going to be sick again, if we're using that as a metaphor. Not that going to prison is the same as going into the hospital, but you get my point. Again, I think this whole almost holistic 360-degree portfolio that you created even for yourself in terms of what you do with your energy and your focus speaks to what he was saying, that if you want real reform, it can't be just reforming the individuals as they come out. Or reforming the system that put them in there. It's also about reforming the communities they have to return to.
It's such an important point, because you look at older people in the workforce and just isolating the COVID crisis, you have so many folks who are having to see work shift rather rapidly to a very technologically heavy way of doing that work. I mean, you and I are talking right now over Zoom, and 6, 9, 12 months ago, many people in the world didn't even know what some of these platforms look like. That's a pretty significant challenge for everyone. It's an especially significant challenge if you're an older person. So perhaps you are less engaged with some of the technological revolutions that are taking place. But then you add onto that the fact that you haven't been around as these revolutions have been taking place. You left and perhaps served your time, and you emerge from having served that time, and the world has fundamentally changed. And the expectation from a lot of folks, particularly who are making decisions in the criminal justice system, is that you're just going to be fine. We're not going to give you any support. We're not going to give you any guidance. We're not going to give you any context around those changes in the world. And then we're going to be surprised when there's increased rates of recidivism. That's just a fundamentally bad way to think about a system. It's a system that's set up to fail. And so we have to recognize that if we want our communities to be as strong as possible, we have to create policies that offer support to older workers, to people who are marginalized in some other way, people with disabilities, people who have served their time. And particularly if you look at the intersectional nature of so many of these folks, you're not just an isolated person. They are a person who may have served time, but a person who also may have addiction issues. They are a person who may have a disability, and a person who also may find getting to and from their job challenging. If we can create systems that don't just look at isolated ways of solving these problems, but as you mentioned, looking at them holistically, we're going to have better outcomes. And ultimately, that is what we should all be focused on.
You talk about the multiple needs and intersectionality of the challenges facing the person returning back to these communities. The same gentleman I'm thinking of, he said after housing, the second most needed request of a recently released person from prison was mental wellness or mental health resources that nobody thinks about really, for the most part, when it comes to what do they need. He's like, there's many of us that need to be emotionally restabilized from trauma that was before they went to prison that never got dealt with, which may have led to the criminal behavior in the first place. And that's never addressed. So you're saying a mouthful in terms of just how complex it really is. What criminal justice reform really is really community and systemic reform beyond the quote unquote former criminal. The other thing I want to ask you about is, talk to me about or do a deeper dive, because I think you hit a great point, but I don't think people really get it. I mean, you were talking about maybe people over 50 who may not be, quote unquote tech savvy, but I've talked to young men in particular who's like, I went into prison when I was 21. I came out when I was 36, which is still young, but think of what I missed in 14, 15 years. Like I never saw, Twitter wasn't invented yet. I never saw fax machines too far back, but people don't realize all the things that have just come about in the last 15 years that we take for granted. So even if you're a quote unquote young person, you can literally be like, this is like the Jetsons. What happened while I was gone? And you're right, the training and the reaccommodation, if you will, is really just get back out there and work hard and do your best and stay out of trouble.
Yeah, I mean, I think 15 years is a long time in a vacuum, but when you look at 15 years in the internet age and sort of digital revolution that's taken place, as we mentioned, I'm in tech, and so I've worked at 3 tech companies, 2 of which didn't exist over the course of 15 years ago, and so it's challenging to ask people to reacclimate to a world that, in many ways, they probably feel like has left them behind. And I think that's one of the things that's really exciting and energizing about the Council on Criminal Justice, of which I'm so fortunate enough to be a member, is we have drawn on the expertise of people who have a totality of experience across different sectors, of different ages and experiences in their spaces, to really come up with solutions that account for the fact that everyone is approaching their reentry into society, their desire and attempts to get access to affordable housing, or their efforts to get a job that's going to sustain them. Everyone is approaching these things from different perspectives. And so the CCJ is chaired by, Sally Yates on one side of the aisle. She's, of course, the Deputy Attorney General under President Obama, and Mark Holden of Koch Industries on the other perspective. So you have this very, very different approach to just general ways of thinking, ways of problem solving, politics more generally. But on this issue, there's alignment. There's alignment around the fact that we need to have skills and training and expertise to help reacclimate these people into society. We need to push current and former policymakers to make their voices heard, to engage in the process of creating an apparatus by which people have access to those things that they need. Mental health being, very much near the top of that list, but not just making sure that mental health resources exist. Hey, if a person reenters into society and they have to access that through telemedicine, are we creating a structure by which a person knows how to get on a computer, sign in, make sure that their data is made private, and can really express themselves via screen to a stranger if they've perhaps never done that in their entire lives? We can't have this expectation that because they've served time, everything is going to be perfect once they've served that time. In fact, we know the data shows that that's not the case at all, particularly when we don't do a good job of providing these resources. So I think you need people who are involved in tech. I think you need people who, as you mentioned, have lived experience, having sort of left society for a while and re-entered into society, and hearing from them about their experiences, their journey, what things worked and what things didn't work for them in terms of getting back onto their feet. This has to be an all hands on deck approach. And that's one of the really great things, again, about the council is, I come from the corporate world. I was invited to join. I have folks who are colleagues of mine who are former governors and state senators and administration officials, people who work in academia, people who are activists and advocates. The scope of this challenge is as big as we have in this country, and the only way we can ever hope to come up with real and substantive solutions is by having a similar scope of expertise involved. And we're just one organization focused on that. But as more and more organizations continue to take that approach, my hope is that we'll start to have some real solutions to some of these issues.
One of my points of optimism on this issue, as we are in an election year, is that criminal justice reform, particularly over the last decade, is probably one of the few issues that, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, whether you're a conservative, liberal, Republican, Democrat, I mean, obviously we're in a very polarized country the last decade or so, but this is like one of the few areas that everybody's like, no, we need to do something about this. It's one of the few times I've seen conservatives and liberals sitting at the same table saying, let's work on this together because we're in agreement on this. So I do take some degree of optimism from that, no matter what happens in November. What do you see as, let's assume that we're now in January 2021. Let's assume that we are making some kind of stabilization in the post-COVID world. I'm not saying it's going to be over, but we'll figure out a way to have restabilize ourselves as a functional economy. What do you think should be kind of the major priorities that our listeners should be focusing on in terms of policy and possibilities around criminal justice reform moving forward?
Well, it's a great question, and I'll just touch briefly on the point you made before around bipartisanship. I think you're exactly right that this is one of these rare issues, even now in a time of just sort of unprecedented polarization where people can come to the table. I remember a couple of years ago being at a White House meeting with Matt Bevin, who's the former governor of Kentucky and actually a former trustee of the Council on Criminal Justice Reform, and John Hickenlooper, who's now running for the Democratic seat in Colorado for the United States Senate. Matt Bevin used to serve with Sherilyn Ifill, who runs the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, as trustees of the CCJ. So there is absolutely unique opportunity. I wish there was more opportunity. I wish it wasn't just this issue, but it feels like it is just this issue. I think the interesting thing about looking forward and seeing where we are in January, I think a lot of people look at, rightly so, the question of the presidency, the control of the Senate, what the House looks like as the most meaningful contributors to where we're going to be on this issue. And I think those all couldn't matter more. Please get out and vote. Make sure you have a plan in order to make sure you get registered and know how you're going to vote, and recognizing that there are going to be some challenges around how we go about voting this year that have never happened before. That is all of primary and profound importance. I will say one silver lining that I take with me around this issue is there's actually a lot of work that doesn't require the federal government to happen. If we were entirely dependent on the federal government to get a lot of this work done, I'd be a little bit more concerned, because we've seen over the last couple of weeks and months the challenges that take place in a society when you rely on the federal government and you don't feel like that government is doing their job. So I actually think there's a lot of work that can be done at the states. Some of the leading reforms in the last couple of years have come from governors. I mentioned Governor Bevin in Kentucky and Governor Hickenlooper in Colorado, who really sort of led some of the charges in their states around making sure that reform was a part of their agendas. We have people who are part of the Alliance who are former or current state legislators, or who govern state legislators. Governor Jerry Brown in California, for example. We have Jeff Brandes from Florida, a former state senator. We have Mayor Michael Nutter from Philadelphia, who's on our board of trustees. I think when you have people who've worked outside the federal government but recognize that they're really held accountable on a much more short-term basis based on the quality of life that they create for their citizens, it creates a different incentive structure in order to get things done. And so it's not surprising sometimes that you see more mayors and you see more state legislators and you see more governors who are involved in this work. And so my advice would be, let's really look at what folks at the state level can do, because we'll see what happens in November, we'll see what happens in January, but ultimately where the last number of years have shown the most meaningful progress on reforms has been at the state level. And if we rely too much on the federal government, I think we might be a little bit disappointed. If we focus on some state reforms, I think we actually might be able to get a lot of things done, and we'll be able to make plans irrespective of what some of the outcomes are going to be over the next 70-something odd days are going to look like.
You make a great point. And if you look at what we've experienced with COVID as an example, and let's take the question of competency of leadership off the table. So I'm not throwing shade one way or the other. But the truth is, in many ways, governors and mayors almost had to be more serious about their response, because the buck stops with them in terms of the impact on the citizens they're responsible for. In other words, they have to govern. There's not just policy making. They have to deal with the consequences of what happens in their cities or their states. And that's why you've seen a lot of excellent examples of leadership among governors and mayors across the country. Of course, I'm biased. I live in New Jersey, and in New York, and we're like, oh, Governor Cuomo is amazing. But the point is, again, without regard to who's a great leader and who's not, the truth is, if you're a governor, you gotta make something happen one way or the other in a way that Congress and Congress people and senators and even presidents just don't have to have that kind of immediate impact. So I agree with you that if you really look at what we can do on the state level and even on local levels, we can get a lot done in the area of criminal justice reform that is not hinging on what Congress does and what the White House does, and I think it's going to be very, very important for us going forward. Listen, Malcolm, I know I was going to enjoy this conversation. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time and your insights for the show.
Well, thank you so much, Alfred, for having me on. I appreciate your commitment to this issue and so many other issues. My hope is that over the coming weeks and months, we will see a growing commitment to these issues, not just in the context of the horrific videos that we've seen of Black men getting murdered that spurs what feels sometimes like a momentary focus on this. But my hope is that we see this focus as something that's sustainable, something that isn't just something that it is captured by the moment, and a movement that will really continue irrespective of who wins and who loses over the course of the coming months. So the way we get there is by people like you having a commitment to these issues and using your platform for it. So I'm appreciative of the opportunity to share that with you today.
Well, you said it in a nutshell. What inspired me to start this Beyond the Hype series, that it's easy to get caught up in the hype of the moment. I mean, and we should, because these are important issues in the moment, but the solutions tend to take root over time when the spotlights are off and the headlines are no longer focused on this. And it's sad, frankly, that we need to see 8 minutes and 46 seconds of the last minutes of a person's life to move. But now that we're moving, my goal is to have these conversations to keep us moving. We don't have those kinds of tragedies to spark our passions around it. So thank you. Again, I appreciate you being a guest on the show.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it as well.
And this is the latest edition of Beyond the Hype. I'm Alfred Edmond Jr. with Black Enterprise. Thanks for joining us.